The morning sun spilled golden streaks across the kitchen floor as I sat across from my father, watching him sip his coffee. Black, no sugar, just the way he liked it. His hands, rough from years of labor, gripped the ceramic mug as he scanned the newspaper, his routine as steady as the foundation of our home. Or so he thought. My father wasn't just any man. He was the type who believed in hard work, in building things from the ground up, in earning what you had. His home was his pride, a place where every nail, every coat of paint, held memories. He bought this house decades ago, back when the neighborhood was still young, still full of promise. "This place will always be ours," he'd say, patting the wooden railing of the porch, the same porch he had built with his own hands. Little did he know, forces beyond his control were already working to take that security away from him. When my father first bought his home, the HOA was nothing more than a helpful neighborhood committee, a few well-meaning people organizing block parties, maintaining the entrance sign, and sending out monthly newsletters. It was small, reasonable, and, most importantly, fair. He had no reason to question them. He paid his dues on time, attended meetings when he could, and even contributed extra for community projects. The HOA had promised to uphold the quality of the neighborhood, to look out for the homeowners, and my father, ever the believer in community, trusted them. But over the years, the HOA transformed. New faces took charge, people with big ideas, bigger egos, and, as we later learned, no regard for the very people funding their ambitions. The newsletters became shorter, the meetings less frequent, and the fees? They only seemed to climb higher. Still, my father paid without question. After all, wasn't this what kept the neighborhood safe? That was before the expansion, before the betrayal. It started with a simple letter. "Dear homeowner, we are pleased to announce the expansion of the Community Fitness Center, aimed at providing a better quality of life for all residents. This project will begin immediately. No details. No prior discussion. No approval from the homeowners. Just a cold, impersonal letter stuffed in the mailbox, informing my father that construction had already begun. At first, he brushed it off. He didn't use the gym much. His workouts came from real labor, fixing things around the house, tending to the yard. What did it matter if they made it bigger? But then came the noise, the sound of heavy machinery, drills piercing concrete, and hammers pounding relentlessly from sunrise to sunset. A once peaceful neighborhood now echoed with the chaos of an unplanned, unchecked project. Then the real nightmare began. It was my mother who noticed it first. A hairline fracture running along the living room wall, faint but unmistakable. "We should call someone," she said, tracing her fingers over it. "Nah," my father waved it off. "Probably just settling. House is old." But within a week, that small fracture grew into something far more sinister. Cracks snaked up the walls. The ceiling began to shift, and the once perfect floors warped beneath our feet. The foundation, the very thing that held our home together, was under attack. Then, one morning, a loud crack shattered the silence. A section of the ceiling near the kitchen had split open, sending a cascade of drywall dust onto the table. That was the moment my father realized something was seriously wrong. He stormed out the door and marched straight to the construction site. "Who's in charge here?" he demanded. A man in a bright yellow vest barely spared him a glance. "Talk to the HOA?" So he did. The HOA meeting that week was packed. My father wasn't the only one furious. Other homeowners had started noticing problems too. Uneven floors, cracks in their walls, doors that wouldn't shut properly. "We weren't even told about this project," one neighbor shouted. The HOA president, a smug man named Richard, adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair. "We sent out a notice." My father held up the letter. This isn't a notice. It's an afterthought. And now my house, my home, is falling apart." Richard sighed, feigning patience. "We assure you, the expansion is completely safe. If there's damage to your property, it's probably unrelated." Unrelated? The gym was directly behind my father's house. They had dug into the land, disrupted the soil, and placed enormous strain on the nearby homes. And yet, they refused to acknowledge the consequences. But the worst part? When my father demanded to see where the funding for this expansion had come from, Richard smirked and pulled out a financial report. The HOA fees. My father had been unknowingly paying for the destruction of his own home. Silence filled the room as the realization settled in. A man who had spent his entire life building something stable had, without knowing, handed his trust and his money to people who betrayed him. That night, as my father sat at the kitchen table staring at the cracked walls, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, disillusionment. The trust he had placed in the system, in the people meant to protect homeowners, had been shattered. And we were just getting started. The next morning, my father woke up with a new resolve. The night before, we had sat in the dim light of our cracked-walled home, combing through paperwork, HOA agreements, and everything we had ever signed. My father's face was set in stone, determined but exhausted. "I've given him thousands," he muttered, flipping through years of neatly filed HOA statements. "Every month, without question. And this is what I get in return." I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just about the house. This was about trust, about fairness. The first stop was the HOA office, a small, pristine building near the community entrance. When we walked in, a young receptionist barely looked up from her computer. "We need to speak to someone about the gym expansion," my father said. She sighed, pushing a clipboard toward us. "You can file a formal complaint." "We've already tried that." "Then you'll have to wait for the next board meeting." I clenched my jaw. The damage was getting worse by the day. And they wanted us to wait for a meeting? My father leaned in, his voice steady but firm. "I don't think you understand. My house is cracking. This can't wait." A voice interrupted from behind. "It's already been addressed." We turned to see Richard, the HOA president, standing in the doorway. His suit was crisp, his smile rehearsed. "What do you mean, addressed?" my father asked. Richard folded his arms. "We hired an inspector. He found no direct link between the gym expansion and any home damage." I scoffed. "Let me guess, an inspector you hired?" Richard gave me a slow smile. "We trust our experts." The rage in my father's eyes was something I had never seen before. But he took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and spoke with controlled intensity. "Then I'll get my own expert." Richard shrugged. "Go ahead, but just so you know, legal action against the HOA is a long, expensive process. Are you sure you want to go down that road?" It was a threat, a subtle one, but a threat nonetheless. And my father? He never backed down from a fight. A betrayal unfolds. We spent the next week calling independent inspectors. Most wouldn't even take the job. "HOA cases?" One of them said over the phone, "They're a nightmare. You'd be throwing money into a fire." Finally, we found someone willing to come. An older man named Bill, with a lifetime of experience in construction. He spent hours examining every crack, every warped floor, every structural shift. When he was done, he sat us down at the dining table, right beneath the ceiling now held together with makeshift supports. "Your foundation has shifted significantly," he said. "And it's no coincidence. It lines up directly with where they dug for that gym expansion." My father nodded, jaw clenched. "So we can prove they caused this?" Bill sighed. "Proving it in court? That's another story. They'll argue natural settling or pre-existing conditions. But between you and me, there's no doubt." But that wasn't the worst part. Bill had another piece of information, something that made my father's hands tighten into fists. "Did you know," Bill said carefully, "that part of your HOA fees were increased because of this project?" The room went silent. My father swallowed hard. "What?" Bill nodded. I looked at the financials. The HOA justified raising fees for community improvement projects. That gym, you paid for it. The very thing destroying my father's home was something he had unknowingly funded. And now, the people responsible were refusing to make it right. The next day, my father called a lawyer. We sat in a sleek office, surrounded by neatly stacked legal books and the scent of fresh coffee. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, listened intently as we laid out everything. The damage, the HOA's indifference, the financial betrayal. She leaned back, tapping a pen against her desk. "You have a case," she said. "But here's the problem. HOAs have money. Lots of it. They'll drag this out, file counterclaims, and hope you run out of resources." My father exhaled slowly. "What's our best option?" Lisa smiled. "Public pressure. They hate bad publicity. If we make enough noise, they might settle just to make it go away." And that's when the real fight began. First, my father sent formal complaints. Again, this time, backed by an independent inspection. No response. Then we took Lisa's advice. We went door to door, talking to other homeowners. And that's when we realized we weren't alone. "I thought it was just my house," one neighbor said, pointing to a massive crack in her driveway. "My basement flooded after they started digging." Another added, "The HOA had ignored everyone." But when we organized a community meeting outside of the HOA's control, that's when things got interesting. A week later, my father received a letter. "Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you are spreading misleading information about the HOA and its projects. We strongly encourage you to cease these actions immediately. Failure to do so may result in legal action. Sincerely, your HOA board." A threat. I had never seen my father laugh so bitterly. "They want to scare me into silence," he said. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." Word spread fast. What started as a few concerned homeowners turned into a movement. People who had been afraid to speak up suddenly found their voices. One by one, they told their stories. The elderly woman whose porch had started sinking. The young couple whose walls were warping. And then, something incredible happened. A retired journalist in the neighborhood heard about our fight, and he had connections. Within a week, a local news station picked up the story. They interviewed my father, standing in front of the house he had spent decades building. "I trusted them," he said into the camera. "I paid my dues. And when my home started falling apart because of their negligence, they told me it wasn't their problem." The next morning, the HOA's office was flooded with calls, emails, angry homeowners demanding answers. And Richard, for the first time, he wasn't smiling. The news report hit the airwaves like a thunderstorm. There was my father, standing on our cracked front porch, pointing at the deep fractures crawling up the walls. The footage panned to our neighbors, each telling their stories. Homes sinking, ceilings splitting, driveways warping. "This isn't just one house," the reporter said. "This is an entire community left to deal with the consequences of an unchecked HOA project." The impact was immediate. Phones at the HOA office rang nonstop. Social media exploded with outrage. A local watchdog group picked up the story, demanding transparency. And most importantly, people outside our neighborhood were watching. At the next HOA meeting, Richard looked different. The confidence was gone. He shifted in his chair, loosening his tie as angry homeowners crowded the room. "We demand answers," one resident called out. "You said this project wouldn't cause damage," another yelled. Richard cleared his throat. "The board is reviewing." "No more excuses," my father's voice cut through the noise. He stepped forward, holding up the HOA's own financial reports. "We know the truth. You took our money, lied to us, and now you expect us to pay for your mistakes." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Then someone stood up. "We need a vote of no confidence in the board." Richard's face drained of color. He wasn't expecting this. HOA rules allowed homeowners to remove board members with enough votes. And suddenly his control was slipping. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. Days later, homeowners received a letter, an urgent notice claiming that due to financial constraints, the HOA fees were increasing again. It was a last-ditch effort to force us to pay for their mistakes. Furious, my father stormed back into Lisa's office. "They're trying to squeeze us dry before we can vote them out," he said, throwing the letter onto her desk. Lisa smirked. "They just made a mistake." "What do you mean?" I asked. "This proves they knew the project was a disaster," she said, tapping the letter. "They wouldn't need more money if everything was fine. They just gave us the proof we need." With that, Lisa drafted a legal demand, an official cease and desist order to stop the fee increase until full investigation was completed. But the next morning, something worse happened. My father stepped outside and stopped dead in his tracks. A violation notice was taped to our front door. Failure to comply with HOA maintenance standards. We weren't alone. Neighbors up and down the block found similar notices. Petty fines, new rules, sudden violations. They're retaliating, my father muttered. And that's when we realized this wasn't just about money anymore. This was war. But Richard and his board had underestimated us. Because something incredible happened. The local government got involved. Apparently, the media coverage had reached a city council member who didn't take kindly to corrupt HOAs. Within days, an official zoning inspector showed up, one who wasn't hired by the HOA. The result? The gym expansion had violated multiple building codes. Who approved this? The inspector demanded. Richard stammered. The room fell silent. It turned out permits were rushed, safety inspections were skipped, and the board had cut corners everywhere. And now, the city was threatening massive fines and potential legal action. Richard's smug grin? Gone. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. A vote was happening. Richard, now looking worn and frantic, begged for another chance. This was a misunderstanding, he said. We had the community's best interest. You lied to us, Richard. My father's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel behind it. You took our money. You destroyed our homes. And now you want us to trust you again. Silence. Then, one by one, hand shot into the air. The vote was counted. Richard and his entire board were officially removed. Cheers erupted. Some neighbors hugged. Others shook my father's hand. But Richard? He simply stood there, shell-shocked. He wasn't in control anymore. And justice? Justice had finally arrived. In the months that followed, the HOA was rebuilt from the ground up. The new board, real homeowners, not power-hungry schemers, immediately did what the old one wouldn't. White heavy checkmark independent contractors were brought in to assess and fix the damages. White heavy checkmark a lawsuit was filed against the previous board for misusing funds. White heavy checkmark fees were restructured, so homeowners actually knew where their money was going. As for my father, he finally got what he deserved. Repairs fully paid for by the new HOA. I watched as he stood on our freshly rebuilt porch, running his hand along the wood he had once built himself. You did it, I said. He smiled, eyes glistening. We did it. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a house. It was about standing up for what's right. And that's a battle worth fighting. The takeaway. If there's one lesson in all of this, it's this. Backhand index pointing right. Never blindly trust those in power, even when they seem like they have your best interests at heart. Backhand index pointing right know where your money is going. HOA fees, taxes, everything. You deserve transparency. Backhand index pointing right, speak up. Corrupt systems thrive on silence. The moment you push back, they start to crumble. And most importantly, backhand index pointing right, your home is more than a house. It's your legacy. And no one has the right to take that from you. The end.